Today, we have the honor of speaking with Dr. Vladimir Brovkin, a distinguished historian and political analyst known for his expertise on the Russian history, Soviet politics, and contemporary Russian-Western relations. Dr. Brovkin has provided critical insights into the dynamics of post-Soviet Russia, NATO expansion, and the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We will be asking some questions to Dr. Brovkin, and we will be, thankful for his time and expertise. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
How do you assess the West's response to Russian security concerns over NATO expansion? And do you believe these concerns were adequately addressed in past?
Yes, well, this is, of course, the central question of the current East-West relations, and also is the most important reason for the current war in Ukraine. What I'm saying has actually been said many times by esteemed Western scholars, my former colleague at Harvard, Jeffrey Sachs, who is now at Columbia. He says it very eloquently, in fact, probably better than I do, because he's an economist. He's internationally known for his work in development in many, many countries. Basically, his view, which I support enthusiastically, is that the origin of the current conflict go back to 2008, when a decision was made to include Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. Now, the Russians consider, this is where my knowledge of Russian history steps in, because Jeffrey is focusing on American foreign policy. The people have to understand that Ukraine was a part of Russia for 800 years. Kiev and Rus, the very origin of Russian nation go back to Kiev. And at that time, there was no Ukraine. This concept appeared in the 17th century. It was a Slavic people who were Orthodox as opposed to Catholic. If they were Catholic, they were Poles. If they were Orthodox, they were Russian. In fact, a province in Ukraine was called a Russian kingdom in the 9th century. So the origins of Russian nation are there. And then came interruptions and the Mongol conquest and so on and so forth. I don't want to retell the story. The point is that for the Russian people, Kiev is not a foreign territory. Ukraine as itself, all of it, is not a foreign territory, even the Western Ukraine. The relations could have been good, like Canada and the US, and they were quite good in the early 90s. But then, of course, due to a number of changes, domestic and foreign, it came to a war. But that's what's important to understand. Expansion of NATO into Ukraine was perceived by Russians as pretty much an affront that could not simply be silenced and ignored.
So how would you explain the significance of Crimea to Russia, both historically and geopolitically, and why its annexation in 2014 was so central to the Putin's strategy?
Yes. Well, I studied extensively the crisis of 2014 on a day-to-day basis, and I read proceedings of the Crimean parliament at the time. Briefly on the history of Crimea, it used to be a Islamic kingdom in the 14th century that was a remnant of the Mongol Empire. They had quite a civilization. There's Bakhchisarai architecture, and they were quite developed, an interesting example of a Muslim civilization. But then in a war with Russia, they lost after they were a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. And in the 18th century, Catherine the Great moved to Russian troops to the south, as a result of which Crimea and the south of Russia, which today is called south of Russia, at that time it was open steppe or as the Poles called it, Dikaya Pole, which could be translated as a wild field. So these territories were conquered by Catherine II, and the Khanate of Crimea became a part of Russia, not Ukraine. There was no Ukraine at that time. The Ukraine was territories in Poland, at the edge of Poland. Anyway, so since then, the Crimean Tatars lived there, and they were in central parts of the Crimean Peninsula. And on the southern coast, it became a kind of resort area with Russians settling there. In fact, Nicholas II had it's a beautiful palace where World War II negotiations between Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin took place right in the palace of Nicholas II. So what really should be mentioned about the history of Crimea is the deportation of Crimean Tatars by Stalin, which many consider to be a crime, and it probably is. The only thing that the Soviets were saying in their defense is that Crimean Tatars welcomed the Germans when the Germans came to this territory during World War II. Now, whether this is true, whether this is not true, it doesn't matter, because, punish the entire people for actions of individuals is obviously a crime. So this created this kind of situation where Crimean Tatars were trying to come back there, and they were allowed to in the 60s and so on. But it was never, Crimea was never a part of Ukraine. That's the point, never.
Okay.
In 1954, Khrushchev, who is Ukrainian by nationality and who was the ruler of the Soviet Union, or the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, decided to make a administrative change from the Russian Soviet Socialist Federative Republic of the USSR. Crimea was given to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic of the USSR in honor of the 300th anniversary of Ukraine joining Russia, which is 1654, when Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainian leader, wrote a letter to Alexei, the Tsar of Russia, asking him to be taken into protection against the Catholic Poles. So to commemorate the 300 years of the unity of Ukrainians and Russians, Khrushchev changed the administrative division. And it didn't make any difference. Now, today, people are saying this is not legal because there was no referendum, because there was no, vote on it in the Supreme Soviet. Nobody at that time thought it's any big deal, because it was all one part of the Soviet Union, and one thought that it would exist forever. So on the basis of that administrative change, when Ukraine and Russia left the Soviet Union together with Belarus in December 1991, Ukraine inherited Crimea as a part of its territory. And the Russians agreed to it. They said, that's fine, that's okay, you can have it. And then there were agreements made on the Black Sea Fleet, etc., etc. So back to your question, in December 2014, when the coup d'etat and Maidan revolution occurred, the Supreme Soviet of Crimea was discussing it on a daily basis, and they decided and they voted that they will not be a part of Ukraine if this is the government that has seized power. And they sent the delegation to Russian Duma and asked them to help. And it was Putin who hesitated at that time, who wasn't sure. And it was the pressure of the Duma and of the public opinion that forced him to finally go ahead with protection of Crimea from the taking over by the new government in Ukraine. So it never actually belonged to the new government of Ukraine, because they simply refused to recognize the legitimacy of the seizure of power in Kiev.
All right, all right. Very insightful, opinion. Do you think that the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine is primarily about the security, or it is about restoring Russia's influence over the post-Soviet space? That is the argument, that Russia is expanding and towards the ex states. We hear this argument a lot in Western media.
Yes, of course. The Western media keeps on saying how Putin is imperialist. He's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. He's an aggressor. There was unprovoked aggression as the poor Ukraine. This is all, excuse me, nonsense, because the very record of Russia's, which means Putin's actions since 2014, speaks to the contrary. If Putin wanted to take over Ukraine, why would he repeat for 8 years in a row there's no alternative to Minsk Accords? He kept saying it and saying it and saying it and trying as best as he could to implement Minsk Accords. Now, what's a Minsk Accords? Minsk Accords is the attempt to create a compromise between those in Donbass who wanted to secede, who proclaimed themselves as independent republics that nobody recognized. And Putin's idea was that it would remain a part of Ukraine, but they will have autonomy and open frontier with Russia. Now, for those of you who don't know, Russian-Ukrainian Treaty of 1991 presumed and said that should be open frontiers, it should be open citizenship, that people could move back and forth as they used to for many, many decades. So that's the idea. Putin, if he wanted to recreate the Soviet Union, why would he say, no, 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 Donbass, you guys want to be with us? No, be with Ukraine. But in return, you guys are going to have open frontiers. And despite the fact that you will have Ukrainian passports, Ukrainian pensions, Ukrainian everything. Now, it is Ukraine that refused. They refused. If we go to the crisis of 2021, early 22, before the so-called invasion, Putin invited Western powers to negotiate collective security. He invited them to consider various ways of settling this account. I remember myself how Putin waited until the new round of, it was called Normandy talks in Paris and then in Berlin. And he asked Schröder, Scholz, and Scholz came to Moscow, and Macron, and they all negotiated, and Putin begged them, make the Ukrainians accept the agreements which they signed in Minsk. After all of this failed, only after all of this, he said, we will have to use other means. And even then, he didn't start the attacks. And everybody says it's Russian aggression, Russian aggression. Nonsense. I'm sorry to be so rough about it. If you study the deliveries of weapons by the United States, which was actually on one of the NPR programs, I heard one of the Azov regiment guys who were saying, we deliver, there was just enormous inflow of American weapons in January 22. And then they started shelling intensively from about the 15th or 16th of January. Donbass was daily shelling. What they wanted to do was what they succeeded in doing. They shelled and they shelled and they shelled until Russia responded. And when they responded, they were proclaimed an aggressor. So in a sense, it was Putin's failure to forestall this pinned blame on him. Many people are now saying maybe they should have waited until the Ukrainians attacked Donbass, then it wouldn't come as a Russian aggression. But when he openly sent Russian troops to defend Donbass, it appeared to the world public opinion, at least, that it was an aggression, which it was. It was an action in defense of Donbass.
Okay. Well, we have seen over the course of last few years, Putin has been showing a lot of restraint and patience when it comes to overreacting to different situations. Is it a strategy, or because in West they like to portray that it's a weakness, and they also surprise because they are non-stop provoking Russia on different fronts, but Russia's desire is to solve the problem through negotiation. So my question to you, do you think that how has Putin managed to maintain domestic support for his policies despite international sanctions and diplomatic isolation following the war in Ukraine?
Yes. Uh, uh, Putin has managed, this is of course true, he did manage to create and continue to enjoy tremendous public support.
Mm-hmm.
But one has to remember that Putin's policy to the war in Ukraine has been changing significantly from the time it started. As he himself correctly put it, the very first couple of months was not really a war, was not any special military operation in order to force the Ukrainians to actually fulfill Minsk.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we look at the Istanbul agreements, which were reached in March 22, they were pretty much enforcement of Minsk. In other words, if the Ukrainians have accepted this, Donbass would have remained de jure a part of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And they even were willing to make a compromise on Crimea, that it would be Russian, but it would be leased for 99 years, like Hong Kong was. The Russians made enormous efforts in order to please the sensibilities of the Ukrainian government and to again reach a compromise. And what will be in the history books is this famous visit of Boris Johnson, who carried the message from the Americans. It's not
Mm-hmm.
only Bojo, it's the Americans who said, no, fight on as long as it takes, whatever it takes, keep on fighting.
Yes.
And this is what Putin was quite astonished for it, because they didn't expect it. And as we all know from the history of this war, is that in the summer of 22, when American supplies came in and the mobilization of Ukrainian army took place, the Ukrainian army was stronger than the Russian army by 3-1. Now, this
Mm-hmm.
is another proof that Putin had no intention to conquer Ukraine with 200,000 men. And in August 2022, Ukrainian army had 600,000, Russian army was 200,000. This is why the Ukrainian army pushed out the Russians out of the Kharkov province. And as Putin himself says, that he withdraw the troops from around Kiev in order to, as a gesture of goodwill. Now, the Ukrainians say, and Zelensky, that he's a hero, that he pushed the Russians out. In fact, this was one of his fabled myths, that
Mm-hmm.
he's such a savior of Ukraine that he pushed the Russians out.
Okay.
According to Putin, he didn't push them out. They withdrew themselves from Kiev, and they indeed were militarily forced out to retreat from Kharkov. That this is very important, because this generated in Ukraine an idea which they still hold on to the present day, that they can win over the Russians. We
Mm-hmm.
did win, we did push them out. So we just a little bit more weapons, a little bit more
Okay.
mobilization, and we will win. That's the story.
Yeah, but they're not realizing this because the way West is enormously supporting with the weapons and all sort of funding, I don't see West is serious about Ukraine winning this war, because they know for a fact Ukraine cannot win this war. So the most probably they wanted Russia to involve as long as possible. Now, I heard somewhere that Zelensky say that the war end is near. So what makes him believe that the war end is near? Because we don't see any movement on the negotiation table. We don't see any other, progress on any other front, that he is winning any area. Only the ill-fated Kirk's incursion, which has, backfired very
Yes,
badly.
yes. To tell you the truth, I feel very, very worried and uneasy when
Hmm.
I hear Zelensky say that the war will be over soon.
So,
Because what I'm so worried about is that uh, being desperate and losing the war, as
hmm.
Zelensky is, they may try to do something desperate, such as create a nuclear explosion at one of the nuclear power stations and say that the Russians did it, so that finally to convince the West that Putin uses nuclear threat. I mean, Zelensky's undisguised desire now is to involve NATO in the war against Russia, which NATO countries don't want. And the US Pentagon doesn't want either. He's desperate. His prospect is to either be overthrown in the next few weeks, months, or to lose the war in the next few months, or to do something drastic to get the West to fight for Ukraine. And that drastic could be something really that would, for example, like if there was a nuclear explosion, then Zelensky hopes that it would be enough to trigger Putin into, nuclear bombing of NATO countries. I don't think that would happen. Putin has shown remarkable restraint and considered judgment. But this is a very dangerous thing. This man is loose, he's desperate, and he could do something very, very dangerous. That's what I'm afraid of.
Okay. Do you think this winter can be decisive?
I think that if things go the way they do, the collapse of Ukrainian army is very near, because right now they're fighting and they're retreating, but there comes a point where soldiers realize there's no point in fighting. You're losing it anyway. And then besides, don't forget that the territory where the war is going on is Donbass. In other words, these citizens, the day the Russians come, they become Russian citizens automatically, because these 4 provinces where the military action is taking place, it is by constitution is Russia. They have already been annexed, which is Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Donetsk and Luhansk.
Okay, we have, short time. I really appreciate. So I will be asking you the last question. Looking at the Russia's future, how do you think Putin envisions Russia's place in the global order, especially in the light of increasing tension with the West?
Yes, I wrote about that in my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in Search of its Identity. And I'm talking there about the parting of the ways. For the first time in 500 years, Russia does not want to be like the West. It's truly amazing and truly historical. Throughout its history, from Peter the Great, or even from Alexei and his father, Russia wanted to be like the West. Now it doesn't. It doesn't want to have anything to do with the West, because the West is corrupt, because the West abandoned Christianity, because the West is in this woke cancel culture. Militarily, it is threatening Russia. Russia has reoriented itself to the east, the pivot to the east. And Putin's major effort now is to organize a kind of alternative to Western economic order, which we will see in Kazan with the BRICS summit, which is a separate topic. Friendship with China, with India, with the global South, with South Africa, Brazil. I mean, Russia is definitely does not care or want to be a part of the West European American civilization. It has made its choice, and I think it's for a long time.
All right. Dr. Brovkin, thank you for sharing your valuable insights on the complex geopolitical dynamics between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Your perspective on Russia, post-Soviet evolution, Putin's leadership, and ongoing conflict has greatly enriched our understanding of these critical issues. We
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
your time and expertise, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you with your work in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.